Well, our theme for 2025 is Live Like Jesus. And it comes out of a simple desire to follow Jesus and to learn better what that means. Now, we have spent our entire year in the Gospel of Matthew, and guess what? Since we had a snow day last week, it's actually going to go into the first Sunday of 2026. But we've covered just about everything that Matthew tells us about the renewed life and living like Jesus. And now in the season of Advent, what do? We go all the way back to the beginning. So we're going back to the first chapters of Matthew. And not last week, but 2 weeks ago, we talked about the virgin birth. Remember? Baby messiahs, they need both a mommy and a daddy. And they had that. Not only that, but he had parents who were willing to let God do what he has never done before. And it was prophesied over 1,000 years before. Remember the elements of surprise, redemption, and transformation in that story? Well, guess what? We're going to see it again. As we look at the story of the coming of Jesus the Messiah, we see the elements of surprise, redemption, and transformation, just as we see all throughout Matthew's gospel. This week is going to be a new story, but with the same elements. So if you're following along in the outline in your bulletin or online in your e-bulletin, you'll see those same elements are in our outline. Jesus is introduced not only as the Messiah born as a baby, but in chapter 2, he's recognized as king. And that is attested to by the visit of some other foreign dignitaries. And it's also confirmed by the reaction of King Herod, who was apparently threatened by the news of this baby. And like many young heirs, Jesus was raised in exile, hidden away until the right time for him to be revealed. Let me illustrate it this way. You know, it's kind of like certain plants. They need the right conditions, the right soil before they can bloom. You know, Jesus was also hidden away in his early years, cultivated carefully in the loving arms of his family. Imagine Mary and Joseph nurturing the Son of God while the world has no idea that a miracle is being raised in their home. In a way, the quiet, humble upbringing was God's way of having his heir grow up in exile, just waiting for the right season to burst forth and change the world forever. You know, as we celebrate Advent, and Advent means coming, here we are, thousands of years later, 2,000 about, to be more precise. Again, Jesus has gone away, and he is waiting for the right time with the promise that he will return. He's going to come again, this time not as the baby in the manger, but as the world's Savior and as the rightful ruler. Are you ready to experience again surprise, redemption, and transformation? So let's see how these elements play out in Matthew chapter 2. Matthew chapter 2, this is called the surprise visit on your outline, beginning in verses 1 and 2. Now after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he who has been born King of the Jews? For we saw his star when it rose and have come to worship him." Now, Mary and Joseph knew that their baby boy was not entirely like other children. Remember, his birth was announced by angelic visions and dreams, and they wrestled through their own calling of becoming parents to the Messiah. And you remember God confirmed it through the prophet Isaiah, and that was enough for Joseph and enough for Mary. They accepted God's will, even though most people would not understand. You know, God often does things that surprise us. But when he does it, he also confirms it. Not just through prayer and through his word, but you know, there's often those, though they may be few in number, but nevertheless, there are some who will see what God is doing and will bear witness to it. You know, in Matthew's story, that witness, that collaborating witness, comes from outside the story. Even from outside of Israel, from the Far East, the place where they had spent time in exile. Now, you know, we have a popular hymn, you know, We Three Kings of Orient are, you know. They actually probably weren't kings, as the hymn suggests, but they would have been part of the king's administration. They were more likely royal advisors, more of a priestly caste than a ruling class. But they would not have been at all like the Jewish priests. You know, the Jewish priests are offering sacrifices, conducting community worship. These guys were probably more like academics, you know, spending their time in dusty libraries, poring over ancient manuscripts. But they were also kind of like scientists. You know, scientists in the ancient world, they would combine elements to try to discover the secrets of the universe. And believe it or not, the most prevalent science of that day was astrology. That's right. It was believed that the stars contained the keys to unlocking the universe's greatest secrets. Now, those who know about such things today believe that they probably observed a new star being born, or perhaps a visiting comet flying through our solar system. But the ancient understanding was that events in the heavens reflect events here on earth. You know, the stars, they were like heavenly beings, the counterparts to the great rulers here on earth. And a new star would indicate that there's going to be a change in rulership here on earth. You realize the Magi were probably from the same region, probably even from the same tradition as the prophet Daniel in the Old Testament. They would have been down there in those dusty libraries reading and studying all of these ancient writers, including Daniel, who, by the way, you might remember, he prophesied a prophetic timeline of 77s, in other words, 490 years. And if they were counting down the years of Daniel, they would have seen that the time is getting close. They would have also had access to the prophecy of Balaam. Remember Balaam in the Old Testament? God made his donkey talk to set him straight, you know. Well, this is in Numbers 24:17. This is what Balaam prophesied. What I see for them, for Israel, is not yet, but behold, will not be soon. What I behold will not be soon. A star rises from Jacob. A scepter comes forth from Israel. It smashes the brow of Moab, the foundation of all the children of Seth. That was Balaam's prophecy. Now, these wise men who came to find Jesus, they were not the sort of people that would have been welcomed by the average Jew in Israel. They were kind of like your wizardy type, you know? And I'm not talking about Gandalf in Lord of the Rings. I'm talking about more like Harry Potter, you know, not from a Judeo-Christian worldview perspective. They were probably the kind of guys that were scary to young children and also to religious Jews. But you have to remember that some of us were pretty scary too when we first learned about Jesus. And here's your first fill in the blank. Jesus' coming disrupts existing conditions. Jesus' coming disrupts existing conditions. Picking up in verse 3. When Herod the king heard this, he was troubled, and all Jerusalem with him. And assembling all the chief priests and the scribes of the people, he inquired of them where the Christ was to be born. And they told him, in Bethlehem of Judea, for so it is written by the prophet, and you, O Bethlehem, in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah, for from you shall come a ruler who will shepherd my people Israel. Then Herod summoned the wise men secretly and ascertained from them what time the star had appeared. And he sent them to Bethlehem, saying, go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, that I too may come and worship him. So, this King Herod the Great, well, he's a pretty scary guy too. But you know, the scary things that we're used to are often better than the scary things that we're not used to. Remember the Magi, they said that they were looking for the King of the Jews. Well, guess what? That was Herod's title. Actually, Herod's position was more like a figurehead or a puppet ruler. You know, kings have armies, but Herod had to depend on Rome for that. See, the arrangement that they had is that the Jews agreed not to resist Roman rule, but they also would not accept a Roman ruler directly over them. So that's where Herod comes in. Herod's half Jewish, so good enough, right? And Herod was allowed to rule as long as he could deliver taxes and maintain order. And the historian Josephus tells us that Herod the Great was mostly preoccupied with preserving his lavish lifestyle and with passing it on to his heir. You know, he changed his mind several times as to who that heir would be, and the heir that he chose, he actually killed in a fit of jealousy just before he died himself. And his kingdom, by the time Jesus grew up, had been divided into 4 parts, one son receiving the central 2 parts, the central half, and 2 others receiving lesser parts to the north and to the south. So imagine what it would have been like when some foreign dignitaries visit Herod's royal court, inquiring of a newborn king of the Jews. Well, first of all, no one with any religious credentials would have believed them. After all, these men are heathen from Babylon of all places. And who are they to interpret Jewish scriptures? And as for the astrological signs, well, that would have been considered a form of divination. You know, God forbids interpreting omens. Herod, on the other hand, took them seriously. Probably because they were hitting on his greatest fear, not being able to decide his own successor. You know, these guys probably would have felt like a trap set by his political enemies. If he agrees with them, he alienates his base because no good Jew would ever believe their story. And if he disagrees with him, well, then he's a science denier. After all, these guys represented the best and most current practices of the time. Now, I know modern current academics would be skeptical of that depiction. I mean, after all, today we certainly know more than they did. But guess what? They were right. And many of our modern advancements haven't had such a great track record. But Herod did what clever politicians do. Tell people what they want to hear, and then try to use them for your own agenda. You know, Jesus' coming challenged all the usual ways of thinking, believing, and behaving. All the smart and powerful people looked foolish, even stupid. Kings are supposed to be born in palaces. Foreign dignitaries should be entertained in lavish banquet halls. And we expect God to operate according to our most lofty expectations. We sometimes forget that, guess what? He's God. He does whatever he wants. Isaiah 42:9 says this, "Behold, the former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. Before they spring forth, I tell you of them." You know, God told us what he was going to do. There are over 300 messianic prophecies in the Old Testament, and at least 90 of them are mentioned in the New Testament. It's not that God didn't tell us what he was going to do. It's only that we only heard what we were willing to hear. And many people missed Jesus coming. Here's your next fill in the blank. Jesus coming brings God's plan into alignment. Into alignment. That word of alignment is actually a play on words. Listen to this, verses 9 to 11. After listening to the king, they went on their way, and behold, the star that they had seen when it rose and went before them until it came to rest over the place where the child was. When they saw the star, they rejoiced exceedingly with great joy. And going into the house, they saw the child and Mary his mother, and they fell down and worshipped him. They opened their treasures. They offered him gifts, gold, and frankincense, and myrrh. So God sends the world's smartest people to a tiny suburb of Jerusalem, to a humble home, a working class family. And guess what? The stars literally align to point to the right place. Now, today, many people would say that they were guided by superstition. But guess what? They found the place. You can't deny that. And they celebrated what was, up until that time, a secret, only known to a few. After all, who would have known about Jesus' birth up until this time? Well, there was Mary, there was Joseph, there was a handful of shepherds, maybe some close family and friends. And when I say they celebrated, Matthew uses a word here that implies that it was loud. I mean, really loud and obvious to everyone around. You know, first of all, it's not hard to attract attention when an exotic caravan rolls up in a residential neighborhood. Okay? That in itself would have attracted some attention. But how are the neighbors not going to notice when you also throw a giant party? You know how people in small communities like to talk? Well, this certainly would have had them talking. You might think, why make such a scene? I mean, we know what happens next, right? And so I'm here reading the scripture and I'm cringing and I'm thinking, no, don't make so much noise. But you know what? God is not just showing off. This is for the record books. History is being made, and it's important that people notice and that they record what is happening. And these men are witnesses for all of mankind for all time. God knows what he's doing. And it lines up with what he has done and with what he is going to do. You know, events on earth align like the stars with vast spaces in between them. And these wise men bring rare and expensive gifts to a newborn baby. These were their gifts. You know, you would have thought, I've seen this meme, it's like if they were wise women, they would have brought diapers, formula, and a casserole, you know. But instead, they bring gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Gold signifying kingship. Frankincense was symbolic of divinity. It was what they offered on the altars. And myrrh, which foreshadowed his sacrificial death for all mankind. Myrrh was literally used in embalming. God's plan of salvation was prophesied in the gifts that they gave. And not only that, it was given by Gentiles, predictive of God's purpose to redeem the whole earth. Surprising, but consistent with everything that God has revealed about his redemptive plan. So that's the surprise. Let's talk about redemption, the redemptive rescue. We're picking up in verse 12 here. And being warned in a dream not to return to Herod, they departed to their own country by another way. Now, there's no way that the wise men visiting Bethlehem didn't cause a scene which would quickly reach Jerusalem, which is only about 5 miles away, by the way. And God accounted for this in his plan. He warned them to go home a different way. Now, if you know your geography, they could have crossed over the Jordan, either just above the Dead Sea or just below, and there's a main road on the other side which they could have followed to go home. Or they could have gone the other way and followed the coastal highway up and around and over. Both ways avoid passing Jerusalem and potential questioning from Herod's men. But this also buys Joseph some time to escape. And here's your next fill in the blank. God sends us to places so we can say, I've been there. I've been there. Listen to what happens with Joseph. Now, when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream and said, Rise, take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt, and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. And he rose, took the child and his mother by night, and departed to Egypt, and remained there until the death of Herod. And this was to fulfill what the Lord had spoken by the prophet, Out of Egypt I called my son. Now, Herod the Great was particularly known for having a bad temper. Nobody liked him. Everybody was afraid of him. He didn't take kindly to having challenges to his authority, even if they came from one of his heirs. Remember, I told you he killed his heir just before he died. And he would kill anyone on a whim or on suspicion, which he often did. Now, with the Magi gone, they're no longer attracting attention, but they're also no longer providing cover. God speaks to Joseph again in a dream, this time warning him to get out of town. And Joseph starts the journey at night, which is important because then nobody knows which direction he went. You know, instead of heading north and east, which you would suspect, after all, that's the direction the Magi came from, he would probably try to what? Catch up with them and, hey, they've been really nice to him, so why not hang with them? No, he goes the other direction. He goes down towards Egypt. And while Joseph probably chose Egypt for his own strategic reasons, you know, God had a strategy too. This story would call to mind Israel's history. Messiah is identifying with the people he came to rescue. Remember Israel's story? They lived as strangers in Egypt. Well, guess what? Jesus lived as a stranger in Egypt. Israel fled for their lives. Well, guess what? He too fled for his life. Remember how God used the words of Isaiah to confirm the virgin birth? Well, this time he uses the words of Hosea to confirm the flight to Egypt. This is what Joseph remembered Hosea saying. When Israel was a child, Hosea 11:1, when Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. There it is. Out of Egypt I called my son. Have you ever wondered why God allows us to go through some of the things that we do? You know, there's some chapters of our lives that just don't seem to have anything to do with God's redemptive purpose. Why did God direct Joseph to take Jesus to Egypt? Was it that he was going to do anything there? No, not really. Yes, it was to save his life from Herod, who wouldn't have any jurisdiction there. But there's another reason that Matthew alludes to. It was just so he could say, I've been there. Right? Jesus traveled the same path that the children of Israel took, down to Egypt and back again. And you know, you could probably say, well, he was just a baby. So were most of those who entered the promised land. You know, they were just small children when they left Egypt. Jesus identifies with the people he came to save. Remember this verse from Hebrews 4:15. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced the same testings that we do, yet he did not sin. Why is this scripture so comforting? It's because we know that whatever we face, he's been there. Back to the question of why God allows us to go through certain things. Sometimes it's just so that we can say to someone else, I know what you're going through. I've been there. You know? Doesn't necessarily mean that there's anything wrong with you or that you did anything wrong. God says he loved Israel as a son while they were still in Egypt. And God sent his own son into exile for a time. Yes, to save him, but also to save us. And just so that we would know that Jesus has been there. You know, it's all part of the story that God is writing. And there are parts of that story that are hard to live and hard to tell. But to those to whom we tell our story, they believe us when they know we've been there. They believe us when they know we've lived it. It makes the story real and relatable when we can tell the hard parts of our story. And you know, Matthew doesn't hold back. He tells both sides of the story. You know, we rejoice greatly with the wise men, and we worship with them. We gasp at the narrow escape by Joseph and Mary and Jesus into the wilderness. And we shudder to think of what Herod's going to do when he finds out. And that brings up our next point. You know, suffering is part of birth. Suffering is part of birth. Or you could say it's part of life, but specifically birth. Picking up in verse 16. Then Herod, when he saw that he had been tricked by the wise men, became furious, and he sent and killed all the male children in Bethlehem and all in that region who were 2 years old and under, according to the time that he had ascertained from the wise men. Then what was fulfilled, what was spoken by the prophet Jeremiah. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and loud lamentation. Rachel weeping for her children. She refused to be comforted because they are no more. You know, this is a really, really sad part of Jesus' birth story. The wise men must have told Herod that the star appeared sometime within the last year or two. And just to be sure, Herod eliminates all the potential male children corresponding to that time frame. Another element of the story aligns with Israel's story. The massacre of the innocents by Herod corresponds to the genocide that Pharaoh committed when he ordered all of the male children to be killed. It was at that time that Moses was born. Just outside of Bethlehem is the tomb of Rachel, the favorite wife of Jacob, the patriarch. Remember her story? You may remember that she died while she was giving birth to Benjamin, the youngest son of Jacob, while Jacob was sojourning in the land and while Joseph was still down in Egypt. It said that Rachel died in great pain and suffering while she was giving birth. And had Jacob not intervened, Benjamin would have had a different name. He would have been named for her suffering. And that would have been all that was remembered. But that's not how the story goes. Yes, we remember the suffering, but we also remember what came out of it. And that's the point that Jeremiah is making when he makes this statement that's quoted here. Jeremiah is referring to Rachel's story when he's prophesying to the exiles in Babylon. And he's reminding them, Rachel died weeping, but she also brought forth a son. And sometimes it seems like our suffering is endless. When we are in that moment where we're suffering, sometimes all we can remember is our suffering. And all we can foresee is more suffering. But it's in those times that we need to remember that suffering is a backdrop for God's redemption. The passage that Matthew quotes from Jeremiah, well, it goes like this. Jeremiah 31:15-17. Thus says the Lord, a voice is heard in Ramah, lamentation and bitter weeping. Rachel is weeping for her children. She refuses to be comforted for her children because they are no more. Thus says the Lord, keep your voice from weeping and your eyes from tears, for there is a reward for your work, declares the Lord. Somebody needs to hear that this morning. There is a reward for your work, declares the Lord. And they shall come back from the land of the enemy. There is hope for your future, declares the Lord. There is hope for your future. And your children shall come back to their own country. I know you can't see it through the tears sometimes, but there is hope. God never wastes a trial. You know what redemption means? Redemption means that God turns bad things into good things. That's what he does. And yes, he allows suffering. He allows it for a time. But he also rescues and he redeems. That's surprise and redemption. Let's talk about transformation. The transformative return. So what if the story just ended here? The Magi go back thinking everything's great. Jesus is hiding in Egypt from Herod, and Herod is in a homicidal rage. And you have to admit, for everyone who is in and around Bethlehem and Jerusalem, things are not looking good. But God is still working. And guess what? Herod the Great is not going to live much longer. Here's the next fill in the blank. God brings us back around. God brings us back around, picking up in verse 19. But when Herod died, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared in a dream to Joseph in Egypt, saying, "Rise, take the child and his mother and go to the land of Israel. For those who sought the child's life are dead." And he rose, took the child and his mother, and went to the land of Israel. Now, Herod the Great died in 4 BC. So if you do the math, you can already figure out that Jesus would have been born about 5 to 7 years before the calendar says he was. Okay? In other words, he would have been born at least 5 to 7 before Christ, which is supposed to be his birth. You see, the current dating system was developed by a 6th century monk who failed to account for the difference between Hebrew and Roman calendars. But the idea was to recognize Jesus' birth as the turning point in history. And that it was, give or take a few years. Jesus is the turning point in the human redemption story. And Jesus is the turning point of our stories as well. You've heard me share this illustration before, but I like what the character of Mary Magdalene says in the TV dramatization of the gospel called The Chosen. She says, "I was one way, and now I'm completely different, and what happened in between was him." I love that. I think that's my story as well. I was one way, and now I'm different, and what happened in between was him. That's not only her story, that's my story. It's probably your story as well. It's the story of the world and of humanity. God brings us back around. You know, God brought Israel out of Egypt and out of slavery after 400 years. He brought his people out of exile after 70 years. You know, Joseph and Mary and Jesus were probably only in Egypt for a few months or perhaps a few years, but God brought them back. He always does. And Herod's story did not end well. You know, history tells us he died a miserable and painful death suffering from a bowel disease. You know, he had to threaten and even kill people just so that there would be mourning at his death. And as I said before, he killed his principal heir in a fit of rage and jealousy right before he died. And he left Judea in political chaos and turmoil. He had rival sons which were each claiming to be his heir. And as I said, for the people in Jerusalem and Bethlehem and all of Judea and Samaria, it probably felt as if the world was falling apart, when in fact, things were just beginning to come together. Messiah had come. The anointed king was hidden safely away, just waiting for the right time to be revealed. And the stories of angels and wise men gave way to the more immediate concerns of the day. You know, sometimes when we're in the middle of a difficult and intense situation, it can be difficult to put it into perspective. Life goes on. Situations change, and hopefully eventually for the better. You know, new opportunities arise, and we can't see it, but God is patiently working through it all. And here's the next fill in the blank. He guides us to the right place. He guides us to the right place. Picking up in verse 22. But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there. And being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee. And he went and lived in a city called Nazareth, so that what was spoken by the prophets might be fulfilled, that he would be called a Nazarene. Now Archelaus was one of the sons of Herod. He was kind of the next up after the one who was killed. And Herod had had kind of some issues with him in the process, so that's why everything was contested. But he was eventually given, so the territory was divided up into 4 parts, and he was given 2 of those parts, the central parts, basically Judea and Samaria. However, his right to rule was also contested by his brothers, who appealed directly to Caesar, and they were given regions in the north and in the south, in the far north and in the far south, to rule. Now, Archelaus was especially cruel, like his father, and so Joseph, when he heard, okay, Archelaus has been given the regions of Judea and Samaria, he's like, yeah, I don't want to go there. So he went to the northern region, which was under Herod Antipas. And they settled in Nazareth, which Luke tells us, by the way, they had lived in Nazareth before the betrothal and before the census. However, the detail that Matthew finds most fascinating is just that name, Nazareth. Jesus would be a Nazarene. Now, a Nazarene is someone from Nazareth. According to what we read in the New Testament, it was not a compliment to be from Nazareth. That was a real backwoods town. Similar, but not the same, is the word Nazarite. Now, you remember Nazarite from the Old Testament? A Nazarite was a person who was set apart, devoted to God, like Samson. Samson was an example of a Nazarite in the Old Testament. Now, Jesus was not exactly a Nazarite. We never read that Jesus took a vow to become a Nazarite, and it appears that he did things that Nazarites don't do, like turning water into wine and apparently drinking it also. Just like the prophecies of Isaiah and Hosea, if you take them too literally or read too much into it, you kind of end up doing these mental gymnastics trying to explain it all. But sometimes God is just having fun with language. You know, it's simply amusing that Jesus grows up in a place where he is identified both as a Nazarene, which is basically a nobody, and at the same time, a Nazarite, which is a special individual set apart for God's purposes. Oh, and that's not all, because Matthew says he's quoting the prophets. But you can't find any place in the Old Testament where any prophet says that he was either a Nazarene or a Nazarite. But what do you find? You find this other word, netzer, in Hebrew. What Matthew is most likely doing is he is making a play on words between the names Nazareth, Nazarite, and the Hebrew word netzer, which means branch. And this comes from Jeremiah 33:15. Actually, only one of the places it's mentioned. It's mentioned several places. Jeremiah prophesied, "In those days and at that time I will cause a righteous branch to spring up for David, and he shall execute justice and righteousness in the land." So Jesus is all these things at once. He identifies with human weakness and suffering. He's been there, whether it's living in Egypt or growing up in Nazareth. And yet he's totally set apart, the kind of person that's recognized by foreign dignitaries, but not by most of the people around him. To them, he seems to be an ordinary guy. But at the same time, he's the son of David, literally a living branch of the ancient line of kings. But for most Jews living at his time, that meant nothing. And yet it meant everything. Because the hope of the promise of God's restoration is still alive. You just have to know where to look for it. And now we celebrate Advent, 2,000 years later. And what's happening now? I mean, to all of us who watch the news and look around us, it seems like chaos. Kind of like people in Bethlehem and Jerusalem at the time shortly after Jesus was born. But where is Jesus? Jesus has gone away, but with the promise that he will return. Not as the baby in the manger, but as the world's Savior and rightful ruler. So are we ready for surprise, redemption, and transformation? Pat? Here's some questions for reflection this week. It is said that wise men still seek him. But remember who the wise men were? What if the people seeking Jesus are not your usual church people? Does God still reveal himself in mysterious ways and to complete outsiders? Are you open to having spiritual conversations with anyone who asks? Here's another question. What does it mean to you to know that Jesus has been there? What does it mean to know that he identifies with us as people and with our stories? And do you think perhaps God also gives you a story so that you can say, I've been there? That leads to the next question. What do you do with the really hard parts of your story? You know, when you're going through pain and suffering, do you consider that perhaps God is birthing something new? Do you wait and hope and anticipation that God will bring you back around? Let's stand. Let's worship the Lord as we think about these things.